Coming up on this week's episode of The Insight, the Intelligence Fusion team are discussing the impacts of climate change, in particular the role it plays in both food and water security across the world. We also look at the impact on politics, the economy, and businesses. Keep watching to find out more. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Insight, an Intelligence Fusion podcast. If you're not already signed up to be notified of new content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now. I'm Laura Brown from Intelligence Fusion, and this week I'm joined by our senior regional analyst team. We have Max Taylor, who leads our coverage in Asia and the Middle East. We've got Viraj Patni, who oversees our reporting in Africa, and Vincent Fevrier, senior regional analyst for the Americas. So this week, we're taking a closer look at the impact of climate change. In particular, we're looking at food security and water security, as well as the political and economic consequences across each region. Now, before we begin, Max, I think you almost want to kind of add a little bit of a disclaimer in at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So basically, we found that whilst we were researching for this podcast, that a lot of the issues weren't strictly caused by climate change, but we found that climate change has made them significantly worse, or has made the impact of these issues significantly worse. So issues such as water security, for example, yes, these issues have been going on for quite a long time, but they are being made worse by the rapid increase in climate change, rapid growth of climate change. So we've broken down the general theme of this week's podcast into a few sections. So we've broken down into water security, food security, and political and economic impacts of climate change. And generally, we understand food security and water security as access to food, sustainability of food sources, as well as reliability of access to food. So we'll start today with water security. And I know, Vincent, you had quite a lot to say about this earlier, so I'll let you start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like you said, so water security, and you've mentioned it as well for food security, is kind of the reliable availability of an acceptable quantity and quality of water for health, for livelihoods, for production, coupled with an acceptable level of water-related risk. So I kind of want to split my section, at least for the Americas, in two. The first is access to water, and then later on I'll talk about Venezuela and water shortages as it relates to kind of energy infrastructure. So in regards to access to water, the case study I kind of want to point out to is Lima in Peru. So Peru has millions of people in the Lima metropolitan region who don't have access to clean water. And often that impacts poor communities the most, as they'll have to truck in water to their own, which is often more expensive than those communities who have piped water directly. So this access is made worse by growing urbanization, which puts a further strain on the water supply, with Lima only having 3 rivers supplying the city. And where climate change comes in is that climate models are kind of unable to predict the future precipitation in the Andes, which is where the water comes through melting glaciers, and where the rising temperatures and melting glaciers, as well as decreased rainfall, doesn't bode well for the future of kind of water supply for the Lima metropolitan region. So it'll put further strain on poor communities who already don't have access through poor infrastructure or through lack of planning. So inability to access clean drinking water can and has led to protests, which in turn leads to road blockages, potential clashes with police, which impacts not only the logistics sector, but also the public utilities sector, who are attempting to kind of bring that access to countries. We've also seen this type of unrest in Venezuela, where a lack of potable water to neighborhoods and communities has been present for months or for days. For others, it's been years since they've had clean drinking water piped in directly to their neighborhoods. And so similar to them, poor communities are more affected as they have to truck in water, with shipments being unpredictable at the moment. So Venezuela is also an interesting case study in that it relies on hydroelectric power for the majority of its electricity production. And climate has played a significant impact on this issue in the last decade. So between 2013 and 2016, experts said that the country received between 50 and 65% below average rainfall, which led to things such as electricity rationing, the government pushing for 2-day work weeks, closure of schools on certain days, and cuts to agricultural output. In regards to electricity, just recently in May, the state electrical company reported that 3 hydroelectric plants were out of service in the Andean region of the country because the water levels in the dams were below the minimum needed for those hydroelectric dams to operate safely. However, there's some dams that have continued to operate with water levels below the minimum threshold, but that's at risk of putting the turbines in danger of breaking down, which would be an even greater problem then. So the lack of electricity that we've seen in the country not only impacts businesses, but also hospitals, ATM machines at banks who rely on being powered for people to withdraw their cash, but also other sectors, and ultimately has led to significant public discontent across the country over failing public services. The lack of inconsistency in the power supply has also led to significant unrest, but which has been made worse by also a lack of food and a lack of domestic gas. The breakdown, and I think you'll probably mention it later on in terms of geopolitical issues between countries, has also led to some neighboring communities in Brazil and Colombia where power is supplied from Venezuela to also lack electricity. So it's showcasing the kind of broad impact of the problem. But it's also important to, like you said, climate change is not just the sole issue. So the problems in Venezuela that we've seen with dams and the lack of electricity stems from corruption within the construction, within the state agencies from the time of Hugo Chavez to now President Maduro. And it's led to kind of political tension between the government of Venezuela, but also between them and the US, because President Maduro has blamed the United States for sabotaging their dams and impacting their security and infrastructure.
I'm glad you brought up dams there, actually, because I found them to be such an important part of water security as a sub-theme. Because as a few of your examples there have already highlighted, dams are often quite international. So the waterways that these dams are built on often come from other countries as well. And this means that the construction of a dam doesn't just affect the whichever country is building the dam. It's got a significant impact on other countries downstream, which, as you just said, lends a more political atmosphere to the construction of dams. It's not simply just a construction project; it's a political project as well. And that inevitably lead to, at times, disagreements. And whilst these disagreements rarely solely lead to international conflict, they do still. It's just another element in international relations that's really important to take place. And I think one thing I found with dams in particular is they're often internally very highly politicized. So they're often portrayed as this a construction project, which the government will try and portray as a way of showing how successful this government is, and they'll attach quite a lot of symbolic value to it, because they're simply saying, look, by constructing this dam, we're building ourselves out of being a poor country to a richer country. So going back to what we said earlier about this being an international equation, the issue is if the country downstream starts to take an issue with the construction of this dam, and the government that's constructing the dam has made this a political symbolic statement, both have backed themselves into a corner here, because they can't then go back on building the dam if they try to make it seem like a political statement. So yeah, dams are an incredibly important theme within water security. And as we said, the issue of dams isn't solely related to climate change. There's other factors in it as well, but climate change is making access to water more important. So therefore, the construction of dams is only going to become more important as time goes on.
Is there a significant kind of example from your region in that regard?
Yeah, so I think one of the better examples I found actually was in the Middle East region, and that's in the southeastern Anatolian project, which is a Turkish project which aims to construct 22 dams, mostly in southeast Turkey. And as I was just saying about the way that this is politicized, as one can expect, the Turkish government has politicized this somewhat, in that they see this as a way of developing the southeast of Turkey, which is economically significantly poorer than the rest of Turkey. Also, the southeast hosts quite a active PKK insurgency, which is a Kurdish militant group in the area. So the Turkish government sees this not only as a political tool, but also as a social development tool to combat an insurgency, which is actually something we touched on last week. So they can't. So as a result, this is symbolically speaking, this is a very important project for the Turkish government and one that they are very intent to continue. But it's caused major problems downstream in Iraq, particularly in southern Iraq, where much of Iraq's agriculture comes from. As the water flows down the Tigris and the Euphrates have been significantly cut off by the damming projects further upstream, this has led to other issues that one would expect as agricultural land starts to dry up due to reduced water supplies. And these, in the case of Iraq, this has included internal displacement, so a lot of urbanization, as Vincent spoke about in the Americas. So a lot of people coming from rural areas now moving to urban areas, which brings in social problems within the urban areas itself. So, for example, social crime-related problems, overcrowding and housing, as well as workers that would typically have been working agricultural land are no longer working agricultural land. So not only are more people moving to urban areas, the number of people working in agricultural land is also reducing. Also, we've seen in Iraq, in a previous instance, actual clashes with often using firearms, particularly in southern Iraq, between tribal groups, family groups, or just any other groups over the use of farmland. And normally this is related to finding fertile farmland that's well drained, so the very prime real estate in southern Iraq. So this creates a really good example. And to throw in a bit more of a political element at a bit more of a strategic level, Iran has also been damming tributaries leading into the Tigris River through Iraq. And whilst this hasn't had the same impact as Iranian dams, what this does is it brings in a very difficult political element to it, because with the USA being very involved in Iraq, as we all know, and a USA and Iran being at polar opposite ends of opposing each other at every turn, any political agreements between Iran and Iraq involving the USA would be very difficult, and they're just made more complicated by the fact that another layer has been added in by the involvement of so many different countries and different political allegiances. But generally, I've found in the Middle East, water security has mostly come down to dams and damming projects, and we're seeing it at the moment as well with China. The Three Gorges Dam has come under significant pressure due to ongoing flooding in China, which has killed, as of today, 141 people. So it's again a major damming project, very highly politicized by the Chinese government, sold as a way of preventing flooding. It's now coming under criticism because of the fact that, well, the Three Gorges Dam in particular is seen as not being a successful damming project. So again, dams consistently prove that they aren't simple construction projects, they're political projects as well.
So I think the issues of water security and food security, I think they're both sort of interrelated. So in relation to water security in Africa, like Vincent mentioned, changing weather patterns have led to erratic precipitation patterns, and this is a threat to water supply. So in southern Africa, which is a good example here, I think it has experienced severe droughts in recent years. And it's in fact the most severe in decades. So this was the case in Cape Town in 2018, where the city almost ran out of water because dam levels were so low. And there's also, like Vincent mentioned, implications for power generation as well. So in Zambia and Zimbabwe, where low dam levels have contributed to long periods of load shedding, and in Zimbabwe, it has contributed to worsening economic conditions, because of, they have their own political sort of crisis going on there, but there's also the commercial aspect. There's a lot of commercial disruption that this is causing. And the food security that I mentioned, significant proportion of the population in Africa, they practice subsistence agriculture. And over 20% of GDP in sub-Saharan Africa comes from the agricultural sector. So, with droughts, erratic rainfalls, and rising temperatures and shorter growing seasons, this is leading to a drop in agricultural output, with subsequent with this sort of impacts on food security. And with regards to sea level rise as well, I think Egypt is a good case study of this, with the Nile Delta region. This is a region where about 20 million people live. And it's also a region where 63% of highly productive land in the country is located. So if the sea level was to rise by 1 meter, then about a third of this low altitude region will be underwater. And there are also other factors that exacerbate, like you mentioned right in the beginning, the effects of climate change, such as population growth and geopolitical tension between Egypt and Ethiopia over the filling of the Ethiopian dam. Egypt is a downstream country, so it's downstream of the River Nile, and it relies on the river as its main source of fresh water. I think it's about 90%. And there is tension over the pace, currently in recent weeks, over the pace of the filling of the dam. Too quick, and there will be water shortages in Egypt. And I think, again, the locust invasion is linked to climate change here as well. So according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, they have warned that the Horn of Africa is facing the worst infestations of desert locusts in 25 years, and for Kenya at 70 years. There are about 42 million people in severe acute food insecurity in 3 regions affected by the crisis. The locust invasion, these have been linked to several cyclones in the Arabian Peninsula. So these cyclones have caused optimal breeding grounds for locusts. Some experts have also warned that because of rising sea temperatures, we will see cyclones with increasing regularity, and with this, more desert locust outbreaks in the future. Again, I think with the effects of global climate, changes in global climate patterns, we're seeing an increase in global temperatures. So according to the UN, a majority of the data sets in 2019 points 2019 to be the second warmest year on record. And because of concentrations of carbon dioxide being so high, along with methane and nitrous oxide, we're seeing oceans sort of absorbing a lot of this heat as well. So we're seeing sea ice shrinking, we're seeing oceans rising, we're seeing oceans also absorbing CO2, which is changing, that sort of changes their pH levels. So this is also affecting fish stocks. So, in this case, increasing ocean temperatures and ocean acidification will lead to changes in marine populations, ecosystem structure, and biodiversity as well. So with ocean acidification, there are implications for the fishing industry. Artisanal fishing and tourism, are critical means of livelihood for many communities in Africa, and they will be worst affected as the fish population decreases. Then there's also the case of, an increase in flash flooding as well. So more frequent flooding has also affected coastal systems in that because of the flood runoff onto the sea, this is sort of reducing the sea salinity, and this changes the migratory patterns of fish who are forced to move further offshore.
I think that point you made about kind of the impacts to the fishing industry is also quite important, I suppose, in my region in regards to the Caribbean, as it takes away from income from fishing communities. And we've seen that impact leading to increased piracy. So probably in your region with Somalia a few years back now, that we saw increased in piracy there, but also off the coast of Venezuela with not only because of a poor economy, because of the fishing industry collapsed a few years back, it's also led to increased incidents of piracy off the state of Anzoátegui, but also kind of between the Gulf of Paria, between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, where we've seen fishermen being kidnapped. So it's kind of fishing communities impacted by low stocks of fish have to find new ways to supplement their income. So Max, in your region, kind of has food security been impacted in that regard?
Yeah, so food security, I find in Asia is a massive region, obviously, and as a result covers a huge amount of different ecosystems. But I would say if I had to single out one area that's become particularly under threat as a result of temperature rise, as a result of climate change, it's probably be Southeast Asia. And the reason being, Southeast Asia is already considered to be at a temperature above what's recommended for growing crops for the optimum crop production. So even a small increase in temperature would adversely affect the Southeast Asian region and agriculture in this region. Whereas richer countries in Asia perhaps can afford to negate this by importing crops or simply using early technologies relating to genetically modified crops, which can negate some of the issues relating to food availability. But Southeast Asia at the moment is also heavily reliant on water-intensive crops such as rice. So while some crops would benefit actually from a change in temperatures, such as sorghum, the most crops that form the staple of our diet, such as rye and wheat, are going to struggle significantly without access to water or with higher temperatures. So a lot of people are quick to point out that certain crops will thrive, but I think it is important to remember which crops won't thrive, and those crops which won't are generally the ones that form staple foods. So something I've wanted to ask both of you, actually, I think this applies to all regions, is I've noticed, particularly in the Middle East, we've spoken now about both water and food security. I've noticed these shortages have led to protests, and often directly led to protests. And I've noticed an inconsistency where sometimes these protests are deliberately, they protest outside private companies, if private companies are involved in the provision of water and food or whatever it may be. And sometimes these have actually manifested themselves into broader anti-government protests. And I was wondering, in your own respective regions, have there been any examples of where these protests have started off as low-level, often just outside company headquarter protests, to more anti-government protests?
So I think, climate change is something that's sort of a slow-burning impact. So it's not like terrorism where over a couple of minutes or an hour, it's like over decades. So I think I haven't seen many protests linked to climate change, but I'd rather, it's the political and economic sort of impact of climate change in some way, how climate change sort of interacts with the, politics and economic and, society as well. So with the political and economic impact, the effects of climate change will lead to worsening sort of living conditions. I think it's worth mentioning that water and food insecurity will lead to increases in migration to, of climate refugees, for example.
Well, can I cut in there? Because I think, like you wanted, in regards to migration, I think that fits in well with kind of the Americas, with what we've been seeing with migrant caravans coming in from the dry corridor of Central America towards the U.S. And that's primarily when we listen to politicians discuss it, we talk about migrants fleeing from crime and issues such as that, but rarely talk about kind of the impact that climate change has had that's pushed for migrants towards the United States. And so in the dry corridor of Central America, which is Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, 2019, and you mentioned 2019 being a high year in your region. In 2019, it was the fifth straight year of drought in Central American corridor, which impacted the food security of 2.2 million people. And it saw, due to droughts in Honduras, it saw 72% of corn and 75% of beans lost in the southern section of the country. And it also impacted coffee growers, and whether in Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala. And part of the reason the drought in 2019 was so severe was that the region wasn't hit by a single named tropical cyclone from either the Atlantic or Pacific sides. And when the rains did come, and they were late and they were smaller than expected, and if they were strong rains, because it was so dry, it led to flooding rather than the soil absorbing the water, and that creates its own set of challenges for communities there. But you mentioned the UN. The UN World Food Program in 2018 surveyed families in the dry corridor, and it showed that 8% planned to migrate due to lack of food. So migration might first be towards cities. So we talked about increased urbanization. But when they do that and there's no job opportunities, or those cities feel the impact of increased and don't have the resources to accommodate that, then that's when people decide to move on. And often in this region, it's towards the United States. So in 2018, the World Bank report found that 1.4 to 2.1 million people in Central America and Mexico are likely to be displaced from their homes by 2050 due to factors related to climate change. This number will go up in the worst case scenario, which we haven't hit yet. And it's also likely to be compounded by gang violence, corruption, and political upheaval, which are kind of the main causes that people talk about when they talk about migration towards the United States. Migration also puts countries under pressure, in particular Mexico, which kind of is between the dry corridor and the United States. And it puts them under pressure because they're host to the caravans, with many of those migrants staying in Mexico, but also because then relations between Mexico and the U.S., we see friction, as we've seen with President Trump and President Lopez Obrador of Mexico, when the United States wanted Mexico to do more to stop these caravans from even crossing between Guatemala and Mexico. And we've seen oftentimes civil unrest caused at border cities like Tijuana by migrants who weren't allowed to pass and who were lacking resources. So we can see that we have to take in consideration climate change and its impacts in certain countries and their implications towards migration toward the United States. So I think when the United States discusses how to solve problems such as migrants coming in, they have to not only address the high levels of crime and corruption, but also set aside some money, if that's the way they want to handle it, towards addressing some of the root causes of lack of food, which has caused millions to decide to leave their homes.
So in relation to your question about water, water shortages and how it links to anti-government sentiment, I think we're more likely to see, I think in general, the coming years, we're more likely to see protests linked to worsening living conditions. But, I think Mauritania springs to mind, as a country where, recently there has been quite, in areas sort of east of, the capital, there have been quite a lot of protests linked to water shortages or poor water infrastructure. I think anti-government sentiment is not always easy to quantify, and whether it leads to, a revolution or something like that. But for now, there isn't any, anti-government sentiment that I can think of.
I think that brings us really nicely onto our third section, which is essentially covering political, economic, and security-related issues which are affiliated with climate change. And what we're talking about, the protests, I think brings me to a good case study, which is Iran. And Iran's seen significant water shortages throughout time. So this isn't strictly related to climate change again, but as we said earlier, in Iran in particular, climate change is causing water shortages in Iran to increase in frequency and also to be more constant and more severe. So Iran, we see quite a lot of protests, almost on a daily basis actually, often small protests in rural areas carried out by farmers who have water shortages and who are normally reliant on trucks carrying water to be delivered out to their villages and towns. So the political aspect of this is that these protests have generally started to merge with anti-government protests. And whilst there is differences, like not all of these water security protests are anti-government, they are rapidly rapidly gaining a political dimension. And as Viraj said, as time goes on, there's going to be more quality of life related protests, and water security is going to be particularly prevalent in a cause of this. Another more conflict and security related aspect that I've noticed with Iran is how vulnerable they are to their current water shortages and to outside interference. So in the late 90s, actually, is a really good example, and this is quite some time ago before climate change really accelerated to the rate we see now. But in the late 90s, even as early as then, the Taliban militants shut off a sluice at the Kajaki Dam in Helmand province in Afghanistan. And the river that runs through this dam runs into eastern Iran and sources a huge amount of the Iranian farmland. And from a security perspective, this put Iran in a really very difficult position because such a small act, the Kajaki Dam is a relatively small dam compared to the crisis it caused. Such a small act actually really significantly worsened an ongoing drought in Iran. And it really highlights, not just in Iran, but in other countries as well, how vulnerable countries are politically and security-wise to such a small act in another country. And Iran actually was at a point when the relations with the Taliban were already very weak, and Iran was starting to deploy soldiers on the border. So again, the tensions eventually wound down, particularly after the US invasion. However, it just goes to prove how important things such as water security and dams can be at a political level.
Yeah, so I think South Sudan is a good example of how existing competition between communities over water and land is a driver of conflict, and how climate change is having an amplifying impact. So studies by NGOs have shown that conflicts in South Sudan have followed extreme weather such as droughts, while there are other factors that influence violence and migratory patterns. So we have to bear those in mind as well. The Sahel region is another region where we see a similar dynamic. So this is a region where, according to the UN, 80% of farmland is degraded, and temperatures are expected to rise 1.5 times faster than the global average. And wet seasons are also shrinking. Given that a large percentage of the population make a living through agriculture, this means that millions are, exposed to the effects of climate change. And I think I think vulnerability also, is an important component to think about here. So, those that do have a, safety net, by the state, if the state does intervene, to assist with, income support, for example, then it causes men to become disenfranchised, providing, non-state groups, how we discussed in our last podcast, with, recruitment opportunities, which is something that we are seeing in the Sahel region as well. While there are other drivers of conflict in the Sahel region, climate change is certainly exposing the gaps in governance and or poor, or non-existent climate change adaptation strategies. And I think that's another important component here, because a lot of African countries are also in need of investment in climate change adaptation strategies. So a failure to make, economies, industries, and communities more resilient will expose vulnerabilities and people's livelihoods to the effects of climate change.
Yeah, and I think in regards to kind of climate change, its effects and politics in the Americas, it's, I would say, less so conflict, as Max mentioned. But I think it's more kind of the political relations between certain countries, as well as the potential for political change and protest. So one good example of the 2019 Amazon forest fires, which were between January and October 2019, when tens of thousands of fires were reported across Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, and Colombia. And while the cause of fires were reported to be slash and burn approach to deforesting land for agriculture, mining, ranching, and logging, as well as the longer dry season caused by climate change and global warming. Particularly important is that the rainforest is the largest terrestrial CO2 sink in the world. And so the fires led to tension between the international community and President Bolsonaro, who was accused of putting his pro-business policies forward at risk of environmental degradation, including weakening environmental protections. And at the time of these fires, the EU and the Mercosur region were negotiating a free trade agreement. And what happened was that these fires kind of put this trade agreement on the line, because some EU countries were saying that they wouldn't ratify it if Brazil didn't do more to protect the Amazon, as kind of the world saw the Amazon as being kind of for the world, not just Brazil. And President Bolsonaro saw it more as kind of an economic opportunity for his pro-business stance. During this period, there were also protests across the world regarding the fires and demanding more action be taken against climate change by world leaders. And as I mentioned, climate change can also be a catalyst for political change and protest. And so I'd like for this, it's more kind of, I would say, the US or Europe, and we've seen significant lobbying on behalf of environmental policies, which leads to proposal like the Green New Deal, proposed by AOC and others in Congress in the United States. But it also leads to protest action directly impacting businesses. So we saw the climate strike of 2019 in September, and companies being targeted if they're seen as some of the biggest polluters. And that might just be a protest outside, or it might be action taken by Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace, where it's more kind of direct action and vandalism to kind of stop operations from taking place. So kind of the political risks and climate change as a whole poses a significant problem for businesses. So I think that kind of leads us to, I suppose, our next section, which is kind of threats to businesses. So ultimately, kind of as a roundup, what would be the biggest threats to businesses in your region, Max?
I think similar to what I was mentioning earlier with the question I asked you guys, I think it's businesses which provide these services, so whether it be water services or logistical services related to food, and NGOs as well that are involved in the provision of food, I think are going to see themselves increasingly under pressure and at times blamed for the shortages themselves. And sometimes this will be the case, sometimes it won't. So, for example, in Lebanon, a lot of the water provision companies are state-owned. So the protesters often gather outside these state-owned offices in major cities, but the protests are generally anti-government. But in countries where provision of water is privatized, we can expect to see these privatized companies essentially bearing the brunt of much of the blame for any potential water shortages. And I think the same goes for NGOs. Like, a lot of the time, NGOs do find themselves targeted anyway by attackers or even protests, whatever it may be, when providing aid, food, water, whatever it may be. So I think as the rate of climate change increases and temperatures increase, and the problems that we've talked about get worse and worse as time goes on, I think we can expect to see NGOs and other aid delivery groups at the front end a bit more, and at times I think directly targeted, whether it be protests or militarily, as a result, as they may be perceived as the ones at fault.
Yeah, I think different sectors of business will sort of experience the different, effects of climate change differently. So, increased flash flooding, for example, that could impact logistics. But not only that, I think small scale and large scale commercial activity as well. There have been protests, to demand more action to be taken against climate change. I think South Africa is a good example of that, but it's nothing like what we've seen in Europe, with Extinction Rebellion. I think we're more likely to see protests linked to, deteriorating economic and living conditions, which climate change is impacting.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think I see similar threats in regards to threats to businesses posed by protests demanding action on climate change, but also threats due to impacts of climate change. So we've seen, as Max mentioned, logistics industry being impacted by protest, whether it be as a result of water security, food security issues. We've also seen looting and vandalism in the aftermath of disasters, which pose threats to businesses, and the use of law enforcement officers to respond to some of these disasters can also create gaps for criminals to exploit, whether it be for fraud or whether it be for homicides or more criminal action in that regard. I think one of a good example to showcase kind of threat to businesses is of Hurricane Maria in 2017, which impacted Puerto Rico. So the island is host to a number of pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities, with some drugs only produced in Puerto Rico. And so the threat posed by the hurricane not only threatened the country, but it threatened that industry, which, if it had been severely impacted, would have had ripple effects across the world. So I think this example showcases kind of the necessity for businesses to have robust supply chains, especially for certain high priority goods like pharmaceuticals. And so if we think of today with COVID-19, if being in hurricane season at the moment, if a hurricane was to take out one of the largest manufacturing of pharmaceutical areas in the world, what would that impact be for a COVID-19 response, which would have even bigger implications. So I think ultimately climate change, it's one of those issues that businesses need to be proactive on, not only in regard to putting in place disaster recovery plans and mitigation strategies to safeguard their facilities, but also in regard to keeping up with the global and local sentiment on the issue, so as to be aware of any threats to their businesses, whether indirect or direct, coming from protests or similar actions.
Thank you very much, team, for this week's insight. And as always, thank you to our viewers and listeners across all of our podcast channels. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please like and share it with your network. Drop us a comment, let us know what your key takeaways were. Next time, we're discussing pipeline politics and the impact on the oil and gas sector. See you then.